The Delacroix estate, with its sprawling gardens and opulent architecture, had always been a symbol of stability and power. But as the family gathered in the drawing room the morning after the gala, the storm brewing outside mirrored the tempest within. James had expected his heartfelt speech to soften his mother's stance, but Evelyn remained an enigma. Though her outward demeanor was composed, the slight tension in her posture betrayed an internal struggle. Charles sat in his usual spot, sipping his morning coffee and feigning disinterest, while Margot busied herself with a book, though her eyes frequently darted to Evelyn. Rosa, still riding the wave of encouragement from the gala, arrived at the estate with a newfound confidence. But as she stepped into the drawing room, the atmosphere thickened. Before James could greet Rosa, a knock echoed through the room. It was the butler, Mr. Hawthorne, who rarely interrupted family gatherings. "Madam," he said, addressing Evelyn, "there's a man at the gate claiming to have urgent business with the family. He's insistent." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Who is he?" "He says his name is Edward Hartwell." The name struck Evelyn like a thunderbolt. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "Who's Edward Hartwell?" James asked, his curiosity piqued. Evelyn stood abruptly, her composure faltering for the first time. "It's no one important. I'll handle this." Margot rose as well, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Evelyn, are you sure?" "I said I'll handle it," Evelyn snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Evelyn stepped into the foyer, memories of her youth surged forward. Edward Hartwell was Thomas's younger brother, a man she hadn't seen in decades. What could he possibly want after all this time? When the grand doors opened, Evelyn was confronted by a man who was unmistakably a Hartwell. Edward had aged, his once dark hair streaked with gray, but his piercing blue eyes were just as she remembered. "Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and reproach. "It's been a long time." "What are you doing here, Edward?" she asked, her tone guarded. "I came because I thought you should know," he said, handing her a letter. "Thomas passed away last month." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. "I thought you deserved to know," Edward continued. He spoke of you often, even at the end." Evelyn's hands trembled as she took the letter, her mind racing. She couldn't let her family see her like this. "Thank you, Edward," she managed to say. "I'll read it in private." Edward nodded, his expression softening. "For what it's worth, Evelyn, he never stopped loving you." Evelyn retreated to her study, locking the door behind her. She sat at her desk, staring at the letter for what felt like an eternity before finally opening it. The words on the page were a testament to a love that had never faded. Thomas wrote of their time together, of the dreams they had shared, and of the life he had built after their separation, a life that, while fulfilling in many ways, had always felt incomplete. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she read. She thought of all the years she had spent building walls around her heart, convincing herself that her sacrifices had been necessary. But now, as the past came crashing down around her, she couldn't ignore the truth. She had chosen power over happiness, and the cost had been immeasurable. Evelyn's prolonged absence did not go unnoticed. Back in the drawing room, James, Rosa, Margot, and Charles speculated about the mysterious visitor. "Whoever he was, he certainly rattled her," Margot said, glancing toward the hallway. "Mother's not easily rattled," James replied. "This must be serious." Before they could discuss further, Evelyn reappeared, her face pale but composed. She addressed them with an air of authority that left no room for questions. "There's nothing to discuss," she said firmly. "Let's move on." But James wasn't satisfied. "Mother, who was that man? And what did he want?" "It's none of your concern," Evelyn snapped. "For God's sake, Evelyn," Margot interjected, "stop treating us like children. Clearly, something is bothering you." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, tensions boiling over. Rosa, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't solving anything." All eyes turned to her, the room falling silent. "Whatever's going on, it's clear that it's deeply personal," Rosa continued. Maybe we should give Evelyn the space she needs. Evelyn stared at Rosa, surprised by her composure. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the strength that had drawn James to her. As the day wore on, the storm outside intensified. The estate's power flickered, and the howling wind rattled the windows. Evelyn remained in her study, wrestling with her emotions, while the rest of the family tried to carry on as usual. That evening, as the storm reached its peak, a sudden power outage plunged the estate into darkness. Candles were lit, casting flickering shadows across the walls. It was in this eerie atmosphere that Evelyn finally emerged, her expression unreadable. She gathered the family in the library, where a roaring fire provided the only warmth. "There's something you all need to know," she said, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. Evelyn recounted the story of her love for Thomas Hartwell, her decision to leave him, and the sacrifices she had made to fulfill her family's expectations. Her voice wavered at times, but she pressed on, determined to lay bare the truth. When she finished, the room was silent. James looked at his mother with newfound understanding, while Margot wiped away tears. "Mother," James said softly, "why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because it was easier to bury it," Evelyn admitted. "But seeing you fight for Rosa, it's forced me to confront what I gave up. And I don't want you to make the same mistake." The storm began to subside as the Delacroix family sat together, their shared history and newfound understanding binding them closer than ever. Evelyn's confession marked the beginning of a transformation, not just for her, but for the entire family. Rosa, now fully embraced by the Delacroix, felt a sense of belonging she had never known. And as she and James stood by the window, watching the rain taper off, they knew that their love had weathered the storm.
The morning after the storm, the Delacroix estate bore a quiet stillness. The tempest had passed, leaving the gardens damp and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Inside the mansion, however, another kind of storm lingered, one that had stirred emotions and unearthed truths that could no longer be ignored. Evelyn awoke earlier than usual, her mind restless. She stood by the grand window of her bedroom, watching as the sun broke through the gray clouds. The light seemed symbolic, as if nature itself was offering her a chance at redemption. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt the weight of her choices pressing against her chest, not as a badge of honor, but as a burden she longed to shed. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to James, her son, who had always been her pride, yet somehow also her greatest challenge. From the moment he was born, she had placed enormous expectations on him, molding him to become the heir the Delacroix legacy demanded. James had been a curious child, full of questions and boundless energy. Evelyn remembered a moment when he was 8 years old, holding her hand and pointing at the stars. "Do you think they're lonely, Mama?" he'd asked. "Lonely," she replied, puzzled by his question. "The stars," James had said earnestly. "They're so far apart from each other." Evelyn had dismissed his musings at the time, urging him to focus on his studies instead of daydreaming. But now, as she thought back to that conversation, she realized how often she had stifled his softer, more sensitive nature, afraid it would make him weak in a world that demanded strength. Now, James was a man, and in many ways, he was stronger than she could have ever hoped. He was fighting for a love she had never dared to fight for herself. Determined to take a step toward reconciliation, Evelyn decided to reach out to Rosa. She had spent so much time viewing the young woman as a threat that she had never bothered to truly understand her. Evelyn found Rosa in the kitchen, a place she seemed most at ease. Despite her new role in James's life, Rosa often returned to the kitchen, where she could bake and cook without the scrutiny of society. She was kneading dough, her hands moving rhythmically, when Evelyn entered. "Rosa," Evelyn began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Rosa looked up, surprised. "Mrs. Delacroix, I didn't hear you come in." Evelyn hesitated, her usual confidence wavering. "May I join you?" Rosa nodded, though she couldn't hide her confusion. Evelyn took a seat at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the room. It was simpler than the other parts of the mansion, but it had a warmth that the rest of the estate lacked. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn said finally. Rosa froze, her hands stilling over the dough. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Evelyn interrupted. I've been unfair to you, and I see that now. You've shown strength and grace in ways I never expected, and for that, I commend you. Rosa's eyes softened, though she remained cautious. Thank you. That means a lot. They sat in silence for a moment before Evelyn added, James, he loves you. I can see that now, and I'm starting to understand why. Later that day, Evelyn sought out James, finding him in the estate's library. He was seated by the fireplace, a book open in his lap, but clearly unread as he stared into the flames. May I join you? Evelyn asked from the doorway. James looked up, surprised. Of course. She sat in the chair opposite him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I spoke to Rosa this morning. James's brows lifted in surprise. You did? Evelyn nodded. I wanted her to know that I respect her, and you for fighting for your love. James studied his mother, his expression a mix of skepticism and hope. Does that mean you've changed your mind about us? Evelyn sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. It means I'm trying, James. I've spent so many years building walls around this family, convinced that I was protecting it. But in doing so, I've alienated the people I love most. You and Rosa, you've made me see that love doesn't weaken us. It strengthens us. James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always longed for his mother's approval, though he hadn't realized how deeply until this moment. Thank you, Mother. That means more than you know. Evelyn reached across the small table between them, placing her hand over his. I've made mistakes, James, but I want to do better. For you, for Rosa, and for this family. Over the following weeks, Evelyn took tangible steps toward mending her relationships. She invited Rosa to join her for tea, using the time to learn more about her upbringing and dreams. Rosa shared stories of her childhood, painting a vivid picture of a life filled with love and hardship. For the first time, Evelyn saw Rosa not as a threat, but as an ally, someone who could bring warmth and authenticity to the Delacroix name. Margot, ever the family's mediator, took great delight in the shift. I never thought I'd see the day, she teased one afternoon as Evelyn and Rosa worked together on a charitable initiative. You've finally met your match, Evelyn. Evelyn smirked, her sharp wit returning. Don't get used to it, Margot. But the warmth in her eyes betrayed her growing affection for Rosa. As winter turned to spring, talk of James and Rosa's wedding began to circulate. Evelyn, who had once balked at the idea, now threw herself into the planning with gusto. She wanted the day to reflect the blending of two worlds, a celebration of love that transcended social barriers. James and Rosa, while grateful for Evelyn's newfound support, insisted on keeping the ceremony intimate and personal. They chose to hold it in the estate's gardens, surrounded by the blooming flowers that Rosa had grown to love. The planning process brought the family closer together, each member contributing in their own way. Margot oversaw the guest list, ensuring a balance between society's elite and Rosa's closest friends. Charles, though less involved, provided financial support and even managed a rare smile when discussing the festivities. Evelyn, for her part, focused on the details, choosing the flowers, coordinating with the caterers, and ensuring that every aspect of the day reflected the family's newfound unity. As the wedding day approached, the Delacroix family found themselves transformed. Evelyn, who had once been the epitome of control, learned to embrace vulnerability. James, who had always struggled to balance duty and desire, found strength in Rosa's unwavering love. And Rosa, who had entered the Delacroix estate as a cook, emerged as a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that love, in all its forms, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the sky a flawless expanse of blue. A light breeze rustled through the trees of the Delacroix estate, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. Yet, beneath the serene exterior, emotions swirled like a storm. Today was not just a celebration of love. It was the culmination of years of tension, struggle, and hope. For the Delacroix family, the wedding was a turning point, a chance to redefine what family meant, to overcome old grudges, and to embrace the future with open arms. James stood at the window of his room, staring out over the garden where the ceremony would take place. His thoughts were a tangle of anticipation and unease. Despite the progress they had made, the day was bound to bring its own set of challenges. There were still whispers about his choice to marry Rosa, and many of the old family friends, those who had expected him to marry someone of his own social standing, were unlikely to let go of their preconceived notions so easy. James Delacroix had always known that his future was mapped out for him. From an early age, he was trained to take on the mantle of the family business. His father, Charles, was a hard man, strict and demanding, while his mother, Evelyn, was a master of diplomacy and control. Together, they had shaped James into someone capable of leading the vast Delacroix empire. But throughout his life, there was one thing his parents had never prepared him for: the possibility of loving someone who didn't fit into their carefully constructed world. Rosa had come into his life like a sudden gust of wind, unexpected, unpredictable, but undeniable. James's relationship with Rosa had started in the most unremarkable of ways. She had been hired as a cook at the estate, just another person filling a role in the household. But over time, their paths crossed in ways that James hadn't expected. Her laughter was a sound he found himself yearning to hear. Her thoughts, though simple in their delivery, had depth and honesty that captivated him. And then, one evening, when the estate was empty and the firelight flickered softly in the grand hall, their first kiss had been a revelation. It was everything he had never known he needed: wild, free, and full of truth. That moment changed everything for James. He no longer saw the estate as his home, nor his family as the foundation of his future. His heart, for the first time, had a new direction, but the road to this wedding hadn't been easy. There had been countless obstacles: his mother's disapproval, his father's indifference, and the constant pressure to uphold the family name. Yet, despite all of this, James had never wavered. Rosa was his future, and nothing else mattered. Rosa had never imagined she would be standing here today, on the precipice of a life she never thought possible. Born in a small, humble town, she had learned early on that survival depended on her ability to work hard and stay unnoticed. She had learned to cook from her grandmother, a woman of wisdom and fierce love who had always told her, "The kitchen is where you learn the true taste of life." As a child, Rosa had often wondered what it would be like to have more than what her family could provide. But after losing both of her parents in a tragic accident, her dreams of a different life seemed further out of reach. She had taken a job as a cook at the Delacroix estate, thinking it would be just another way to pay the bills. But what she hadn't anticipated was meeting James. Rosa's first impression of James had been typical of anyone who worked for the Delacroix family: distant, aloof, and almost intimidating in his perfection. Yet, the more she saw of him, the more she realized how different he was from the carefully cultivated persona he projected. She saw glimpses of his vulnerability, the kindness that lay just beneath the surface. And when they had shared their first conversation outside the formalities of their roles, about food, about life, about dreams, it was as if she had met a different person entirely. And then, when he kissed her, it was as if the world had stopped. It was a moment of clarity in the midst of chaos, a moment that confirmed what she had suspected all along. She and James belonged together, regardless of the boundaries that society had set before them. Now, standing on the edge of this monumental day, Rosa was filled with a mixture of nerves and excitement. She had never dreamed she would marry someone like James Delacroix, someone with wealth and power. But James had never made her feel small or unimportant. He had shown her that love was not about status, it was about connection. The guests began to arrive in the late afternoon, each more refined and polished than the last. The Delacroix family had always been known for their impeccable taste, and today, the estate was alive with the hum of anticipation. Staff members scurried about, ensuring that everything was perfect: the flowers, the food, the music. The estate's grand ballroom had been transformed into a lavish dining area, while the garden was prepared for the ceremony itself. The guest list was carefully curated, with close friends of the family, influential business partners, and society elites. All those who were expected to attend the union of James Delacroix, heir to one of the wealthiest families in the world, and Rosa, his beloved. It was an event that would be talked about for years to come, a union that would shift the boundaries of society itself. Evelyn Delacroix stood at the front of the room, her regal presence as commanding as ever. Despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her, she maintained an air of composure. She had spent the past few months coming to terms with her son's choice, and although it hadn't been easy, she had made peace with it. She had come to realize that true love, though unpredictable, was more important than any societal expectation. Margot, always the witty observer, was helping to arrange the final touches. "Can you believe this, Evelyn?" she said with a laugh. "Your son is marrying the cook. I always thought you'd end up with someone more practical." Evelyn shot her sister a playful look, but there was a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I don't think anyone ever saw it coming, Margot. But that's the beauty of it, isn't it?" As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an ethereal glow over the garden, the guests took their seats. The air was filled with the sweet fragrance of roses and lilies, the colors of the flowers blending harmoniously with the soft pastel hues of the bridesmaids' dresses. Rosa stood behind a large white screen, nervously adjusting her veil. She could hear the gentle murmur of the crowd outside, the excitement building. This was it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for her cue. James stood at the front of the garden, his heart in his throat. He had never felt more vulnerable than he did now, standing on the threshold of a life that was both thrilling and terrifying. But as he turned his eyes toward the path where Rosa would soon appear, all of his doubts faded. She was his, and nothing else mattered. When the music began, a hush fell over the crowd. Rosa stepped out from behind the screen, her breath catching as she saw James waiting for her. She was the most beautiful woman in the world to him, and in that moment, nothing else existed. She walked down the aisle, each step bringing her closer to a life she had never imagined, a life with James. She could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of this day. The night of their wedding had been filled with joy and celebration, but the morning after brought a sense of peace that James and Rosa had never known before. As they lay in their bed at the Delacroix estate, the world outside felt like a distant echo. The trials and tribulations that had once seemed insurmountable were now distant memories, fading in the light of their shared future. For the first time, Rosa felt like she truly belonged. The heavy weight of judgment from society and the deluge of expectations from James's family had fallen away, leaving only the man she loved by her side. Yet even as she basked in the afterglow of their love, she knew that their journey was far from over. James, too, lay beside her, his heart full. He had spent years battling with the expectations placed upon him by his family, never truly understanding how much of himself he had to give up in order to fulfill those expectations. But now, with Rosa, he had found a love that made him whole. Still, there was a deep well of concern within him. The honeymoon phase was over. Now, they would have to navigate a life together that was not just built on love, but on a new reality, one that would bring both triumph and trials. The Delacroix name was synonymous with power, wealth, and influence. As heir to the family fortune, James had always understood the gravity of his position. He had been trained to lead a conglomerate empire that spanned multiple industries, real estate, finance, technology, but the true power of the family came from its social standing. The Delacroix legacy was built on reputation, and the family's reputation had been meticulously cultivated for generations. But now, the future of that legacy seemed uncertain. Rosa, though beloved by James, was still a reminder of everything that had once been considered beneath the Delacroix family station. She was a cook, a woman from humble beginnings, and in the eyes of many, still not worthy of the prestigious title of Delacroix. James had often wondered if he was betraying his lineage by choosing her. But now that they were married, his resolve had only strengthened. His love for Rosa was not a rebellion. It was a reclamation of his true self. But as the months passed and their life together unfolded, James would discover that challenging tradition came at a cost. The first few weeks of their marriage were blissful, filled with shared moments of tenderness and intimacy. Rosa had become accustomed to the luxurious surroundings of the Delacroix estate, but she still felt the sting of her past lingering at the edges of her new life. She was no longer just the cook. She was James's wife, and with that came new responsibilities. Though the family had embraced her with surprising warmth, it was clear that many still viewed her with a critical eye. Some of the staff treated her with deference, while others continued to see her as an outsider. A reminder that the walls of society's expectations were difficult to tear down. But Rosa, ever strong, refused to let the whispers get to her. She threw herself into her new role, not just as James's wife, but as someone who could contribute to the family in her own way. She began taking on charitable initiatives, using the wealth she now had access to for causes she cared about deeply. She worked with local food banks and started a program to teach underprivileged children how to cook, something that had always been a source of pride and joy for her. Through these efforts, she began to gain her own voice within the Delacroix family, not as an accessory to James's success, but as a woman with her own agency and purpose. James's life was not just about love. It was also about running a vast empire. The Delacroix fortune was built on generations of shrewd business decisions, and now James had to step up and lead. As he walked through the corridors of the family's corporate headquarters in the city, he could feel the weight of his grandfather's legacy pressing down on him. "James, you've got a meeting with the board in an hour," his assistant reminded him as he entered his office, pulling him back into the corporate world. James nodded absent-mindedly, his mind elsewhere. He had always hated these meetings. The endless discussions about profits, expansion, and stock market fluctuations felt hollow to him. What he truly wanted was to focus on building something that mattered, not just to the business world, but to the people who would benefit from it. But reality had a way of intruding, and his role as the heir to the Delacroix fortune demanded his full attention. The board meeting was filled with sharp suits, all eager to discuss the company's next big venture. "James, we need to talk about diversifying our portfolio," one of the board members said, leaning forward. "We've seen what the tech sector is doing, and we need to get in on it. The Delacroix name can dominate Silicon Valley." James's mind wandered. He could feel the walls closing in. "I understand," he said, his voice clipped. "But we're not going to just chase trends. I want us to focus on sustainable growth, real impact. We have the resources, the influence. It's time to use them for something that actually matters." The room fell silent, as if no one quite knew how to respond. For a brief moment, James felt out of place. It was hard to fight the tide of corporate greed when so much of it had built the empire he was now running. But as he looked at the faces around the table, he realized something. This was his world now. He would have to change it from the inside. At home, Rosa continued to be a steady presence in James's life, grounding him in the midst of the whirlwind. Though she had her own passions and pursuits, she was always there to listen when James needed to talk about the pressures of running the family business. "I don't know if I can do this, Rosa," James confessed one evening, after a particularly draining board meeting. "I feel like I'm losing sight of what really matters. All this talk of profits, expansion, it feels empty." Rosa placed a gentle hand on his. "I understand. But remember, you don't have to do this alone. You have me, and you have the power to shape the company however you want. If you want to make a difference, it starts with you. I believe in you, James." Her words gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He knew she was right. He had the opportunity to redefine the Delacroix legacy, to turn it into something that could make a real impact on the world. And together, they would build a future that was not defined by the past, but by the love they had for each other. Despite the support from Rosa, James soon found himself facing challenges that tested his resolve. His father, Charles, had always been a difficult man, but recently, their relationship had become strained. Charles had made no secret of his disapproval regarding James's marriage to Rosa, though he had grudgingly accepted it for the sake of the family reputation. But as the months passed, the tension between father and son grew. Charles began to question James's decision-making, both in business and in his personal life. "You're making a mistake, James," Charles said one evening, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Rosa is not the woman you need. She's a distraction. You've let her pull you away from what truly matters." James bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm not the same man you raised, father. I'm not going to follow the same path just because it's expected of me. Charles's eyes hardened. You're running a business, James. This isn't a fairy tale. You need to think about the company, about the future. Rosa is not the future of the Delacroix name. But James refused to back down. He knew that in order to truly lead, he would have to break free from his father's expectations. Through all of this, Rosa remained James's pillar of strength. She had been through her own struggles, and now, as she watched James face the battle of a lifetime, she couldn't help but feel the weight of their future together. She knew that James was stronger than he realized, but she also knew that the road ahead would not be easy. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, overlooking the estate, Rosa turned to him with a thoughtful look. I know things are difficult right now, but we're in this together. No matter what happens with your father or the business, I want you to know that I'm here. We'll figure it out. James smiled, his heart filled with gratitude. I don't know what I'd do without you, Rosa. You've given me the strength to fight for what I believe in, and together we'll build something that lasts. As the night settled around them, James and Rosa knew that they had only just begun to fight for the future they wanted. The challenges they faced were only the beginning of a long journey, one that would demand everything from them, but would ultimately shape their destiny. The Delacroix estate was bathed in golden light as the morning sun rose, casting long shadows over the sprawling grounds. James stood at the window of his office, staring out at the horizon, his mind tangled in thoughts. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and decisions that weighed on him. His marriage to Rosa had ignited a flame of passion and purpose, but it had also opened a door to a world of resistance, both from his family and from the very structure of the empire he was expected to lead. He had hoped that, after their wedding, things would settle down. That love would be enough to shield them from the battles that lay ahead. But the deeper he delved into his role as head of the Delacroix family business, the more he realized that the real fight had just begun. Charles Delacroix had always been a man of principle, a man whose unwavering belief in tradition and legacy had shaped the course of the family's fortune. To him, James was not just his son. He was the heir to a name that demanded respect and authority. For Charles, family was everything, and the Delacroix name had been built upon decades of careful social positioning. But when James had chosen Rosa, an uneducated cook from a humble background, the foundations of that carefully constructed empire had been rocked. The Delacroix family had always kept its distance from the lower echelons of society, associating only with those who could enhance their own stature. Rosa, in their eyes, was not just an outsider. She was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world's changing social dynamics. And no matter how much James tried to explain that his love for Rosa transcended social barriers, the rift between father and son deepened. It was in these moments that James found himself questioning his own place in the world. Was he truly the man he had always believed himself to be? Or had he been molded by the expectations of others for too long? The pressure mounted every day, from board meetings to family dinners. Each encounter with his father felt like a battle. James could see the disapproval in his eyes, the sharpness in his words. No matter how hard he tried to prove that Rosa was not a mistake, that their love was not some fleeting fancy, the reality was that it was a difficult truth for the Delacroix family to accept. In the midst of James's growing frustration, Rosa remained a quiet force of strength. The reality of her new life had not been as smooth as she had hoped. The grand estate, the opulence of it all, was still a reminder of the vast gap between her past and her present. But she had learned over time to stand tall in the face of those who doubted her. As she spent her days in the mansion, overseeing the staff, helping with the charity events, and creating a safe space for the children she taught cooking, Rosa felt a quiet resolve growing within her. The Delacroix family's resistance to her presence was palpable, but she was not about to let that define her. She had fought for this love, fought for a place by James's side, and now she would fight for a future where she could make a difference in her own right. She had grown up in poverty, working long hours in kitchens and learning the art of cooking from the women in her family. Those were the days that had shaped her. They were the days when she had first dreamed of making something of herself, of using her talents to build a life worth living. But now, Standing in the shadow of a world she had never known, Rosa often wondered if she was capable of the change James had imagined for them both. The reality of being a Delacroix, of wearing the title that carried so much weight, wasn't as glamorous as she had imagined. There were days when the loneliness would creep in, moments when she would stand alone in the vast mansion, feeling the presence of generations of Delacroix ancestors watching her with judgment. The staff would whisper behind her back, some treating her with the respect of a wife, others with the coldness of a servant. But Rosa had always known how to rise above. She had learned to navigate the complicated world of society's expectations, and she was determined to do the same in this new life. James was sitting in his office one afternoon when his assistant entered, her expression serious. "Mr. Delacroix," she began, "the board is meeting in an hour. They're asking for a final decision on the merger with Williams Enterprises." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. The Williams deal had been in the works for months. A merger with one of the largest conglomerates in the country would give Delacroix Enterprises the financial backing it needed to expand its tech division. But James wasn't sure if the deal was the right move for the company's long-term goals. The merger could bring in short-term gains, but at what cost? He had grown weary of sacrificing integrity for profits. The board had been pushing him hard for a decision, but James knew this would be the moment that would define his leadership. If he allowed the merger to go through without considering the ethical ramifications, it would be a betrayal of everything he had promised himself when he first decided to take control of the family business. He had vowed to make Delacroix Enterprises a company that stood for something more than just profit margins. "I need some time to think," James muttered to himself, his fingers tapping anxiously on the desk. He didn't want to disappoint his father, but he couldn't let this decision be swayed by the pressure of tradition. As he turned to look out the window, a deep unease settled in. The weight of the company's future, his father's expectations, and his own aspirations for change all hung over him like a storm cloud. That evening, the Delacroix family hosted a dinner party, a regular affair designed to reinforce the family's social standing and foster connections with the city's elite. James had long grown tired of these gatherings, but tonight, the stakes felt higher than ever. His father was determined to remind James of his responsibilities, to assert his authority over him one last time before the board meeting. Rosa, dressed in a sleek black dress, entered the grand dining room, her presence immediately drawing the attention of the guests. She had learned to navigate the intricacies of these events, mastering the delicate balance of respect and diplomacy. Still, she could feel the weight of the stares and whispered conversations. She was the outsider, the woman who had been chosen not by birthright but by love. As James entered the room, his gaze immediately found hers. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the world outside the room seemed to fade. Despite the judgment surrounding them, they were a united front. Rosa smiled, a quiet gesture that spoke volumes. James returned her smile, his heart swelling with pride. Dinner was served, and as the evening wore on, the tension between father and son became palpable. Charles made several pointed comments about James's decisions, each one a subtle attempt to steer his son back onto the path of tradition. "You're running a business, James," Charles said, his voice cold. "Not a charity. Remember what's at stake here. Your marriage to Rosa is one thing, but we're talking about the future of this family. You can't let your personal feelings cloud your judgment." James's jaw tightened, but Rosa placed a hand on his leg beneath the table. He glanced at her, finding solace in her touch. "I'm aware of what's at stake," James replied, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm not going to make decisions out of obligation anymore. I'm not going to be your puppet, father." The room fell silent. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Charles's expression darkened. "You'll regret this," he muttered. The tension in the room was suffocating. James's heart raced, but he stood his ground. This was the moment he had been preparing for, a stand not just for his love, but for the kind of man he wanted to be. That night, after the guests had left, James and Rosa retreated to their private quarters. They were both exhausted, the weight of the evening still heavy on their shoulders. James sat on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands. "I can't keep doing this," he admitted. I feel like I'm losing everything. My father, the business, everything I've ever known. Rosa joined him, her hand gently resting on his back. You're not losing anything, James. You're finding yourself, and I'll be with you every step of the way. Their love was their strength, but even that wasn't enough to shield them from the storm that was brewing. The rift between James and his father had deepened, and while Rosa stood by his side, the road ahead was far from certain. The family empire was at a crossroads, and James would soon have to choose between the legacy he was born into and the future he wanted to create with Rosa.